I wanted to ask you, since Australia, like the US, is a settler nation, what is the, I think it's a multiple part question. How do indigenous ways of living, so I guess Aboriginal ways of living, influence permaculture design and your particular eco-village in Australia, in the Australian framework? And what is the relationship between um, eco villages and I won't ask too broad a question between your eco village and the local indigenous population?
Mm. So there's a lot of different ways to answer that. In conversations with Warunga, who I've introduced you to and hopefully will contribute somewhere on this platform, I spent a lot of time talking with him. He's an Indigenous elder, and he was saying, well, I reckon that Indigenous cultures here were the original permaculturalists. Like, that's how we lived. We just lived in harmony with nature. We responded. We were constantly planting as we walked along, like he'd show me like, oh, here's a native ginger and oh, look at these lovely blueberries. I'll just eat them. And as we're walking along, we're planting them along the path. And so it's not like they just randomly arrived there. Like we planted them, but it's not like how you imagine a Mr. McGregor's garden where you plant the seeds in a row. Like the whole landscape is an edible landscape that has evolved over tens of thousands of years as an edible landscape. And so that's the kind of deeply embedded way of thinking. Like this is a cultivated ecology. It is an ecological system that meets the needs of the wildlife that's here, it meets the climate. So we're growing foods and that belong in this space or are adapted to this space that don't need a whole lot of extra care or chemicals or extra water. So, a lot of the problems in our agriculture system, we try and grow the same thing everywhere and then just bucket load it with chemicals and extracting 70% of the fresh water in the world to keep it all going and then just transport it around the world. This is going, okay, what belongs here? What grows well here? What will just keep on self-seeding? So it's a self-generating system. And that's what I've got going on here. Like I barely plant, but yet I get pumpkins and tomatoes and passion fruits and all sorts of things every year, all the time, just because they keep self-seeding them in amongst like turmerics and native gingers. So there's wild foods mixed with self-seeding plants and any kind of food just growing in this ecological system. So the kind of sense of what an eco-village and permaculture is like is really has, and it was explicitly said by the people who kind of set permaculture up in the first instance, described it to begin with, so Bill Mollison and David Holmgren were the people who first described it. I mean, it keeps expanding every time people add to the concept. But when they said this is deeply inspired by the indigenous and sustainable communities that we've seen around the world, and so it's saying, okay, well, how do we live in places like Australia and the United States in a way that's actually deeply embedded in the principles and practices and values of indigenous cultures? And in a way, I see it as a transitional, like permaculture is a transition, help us to move from this extractive model back to an ecological way of thinking. It's like we've forgotten what it means to live in that way. So this is kind of like a way to help us find a path back to something that looks more like that. And so, but it's not back. It's a forward way of thinking. So in terms of uh engagement here at Crystal Waters, like I would have to say that I don't think the original designers really thought about asking Indigenous local elders about it because it wasn't really in the consciousness back then. Like probably like in the United States, like here in Australia, there was a big blind spot about that, and it's only in more recent years that that has become something. And so since then, there's been regular conversations, connections with the local Indigenous community. We're on the edge of Gubbi Gubbi country here with Jinnabara to our east, and starting to recognise that there's different place names, and the river that runs through our place was named by the colonials as Mary River, but it's actually Mukabulla. And so recognizing different place names and uh, and opening up different conversations and welcoming people here. And so Wurunga also has, free reign of using this space. And so like really shifting how the relationship to how you own land or consider the land yours, in it's more like this is ours and we're caretakers of it and this is how we exist in this place. So there's a deepening of relationship and a deepening of shifting of understanding about how to be in place, and also a huge amount of learning in terms of starting to understand the intense scientific and rigorous knowledge systems that Indigenous communities had in this area. And, I've only been here for 25 years in this particular place, but already I'm starting to see, oh, so when that particular plant flowers, I know that this bird is going to arrive from Papua New Guinea, and I know that it's going to, and you start to see the patterns. It's like, okay, I've only been doing that for a quarter of a century, but imagine being in a place for 60,000 years and having that knowledge handed down. And so what it's doing is it's building up a sense of, oh, like that's what it's about. Instead, went through school. I don't know what kind of education you got about Indigenous cultures, but here, my memory as a kid growing up in Australian schools, like of Aboriginal people in Australia, was with a stick, with a skinny man standing there with his leg up like this, and in the desert as a nomadic person. Like there were settlements, there were farms, there was the whole story and landscape of Indigenous communities here in Australia was not told, probably not even in the awareness of the teachers. So that's completely shifted, and so is, I think, the relationship with eco villages. And I think the eco villages are part of like sort of the front of the opening to going, yeah, the healing of the relationship with the land cannot be done without the healing of the relationship with Indigenous communities, and recognizing that trauma has happened and that something, has to be there in response to that.